The Olympics might be the biggest cultural event in the entire world, and for the first time in over 30 years, the games will be played on American soil in LA in 2028. All this hype around LA 28 had me thinking though, where else in the US could we see the Olympics happen? To answer that question, I spent countless hours researching which factors play into a city winning a bid for the Olympics, and figured out which American cities could realistically be a host in the near future. Now before we look at any of the cities in the US, I think it's really important to consider the recent history of the Olympics, and how their successes and failures have shaped the game's priorities today. The high cost of building a new airport, subway system, and venues in Athens on a rushed timeline before the '04 games highlighted the importance of a city's existing infrastructure. Beijing, Paris, and Rio all had to overcome the obstacles of pollution to keep athletes and spectators safe, and for pretty much every city that's hosted the Olympics, venues that were built for the games ended up going largely underutilized, and in many cases completely abandoned within a couple years. That came to a peak in 2016 with Rio. So in response, the Olympic Committee has made it a big priority to select cities with a minimal amount of construction required, which is probably the biggest reason why LA won their bid for 2028, given the sheer number of top-notch venues in Southern California. After considering what makes or breaks an Olympic city, I created this formula that rates a city's ability to hold the games. Okay, maybe I need to explain it a little bit. So basically, a perfect score for a city would be a 100, and that's broken up into two parts. 50 points for the conditions of the city's environment, and 50 points for the venues used in the games. For the city environment score, 10 points goes to the city's metro population. Obviously, size isn't the most important thing, but if your city is bigger, then by default it's going to have more resources. Whether it's transportation, hotels, construction workers, or service workers. It doesn't just take a village to host the Olympics, it takes a megacity. Also, just a side note, I did this on a logarithmic scale instead of a linear one because there's diminishing returns as your city gets bigger. In other words, there's a much bigger gap in quality from a 1 million person city to a 5 million one, compared to a 5 million person city to a 10 million person city. The next metric, which adds up to 15 total points, is the city's GAWC classification. The Globalization in World Cities Research Network is an organization that scores the global economic connectivity of cities. Now, I might not know the nitty-gritty details of how they come up with these scores, but to me, it seems like a pretty good indicator of both the city's economic health and its ability to serve a massive influx of tourists from around the globe. This one is also on a log scale since you don't really see much of a drop-off in the quality of cities until you get further down the list. Then I found another source, Numbeo, that gives scores for pretty much anything you could think of for a city. But I focused on the scores for pollution, traffic, and safety, since those seem to be what the Olympic Committee is looking at closely in the selection process. And the last metric that I used is the World Travel Index's infrastructure ratings, which is a rating of a city's infrastructure, as the name implies, but it's specifically from the perspective of how it affects tourists. Now, in figuring out how I wanted to rank the venues, I needed to keep things as simple as possible because my spreadsheet was already getting way too big. So that's why I started out by eliminating the venues that are pretty much going to be the same from city to city, just to keep things nice and simple. Almost every major city has a large enough convention center and a championship level golf course. Events like archery, skateboarding, and beach volleyball are normally held at temporary venues, and unique facilities like velodromes and whitewater centers almost always have to be built from scratch, and they don't typically draw especially large crowds to begin with. After trimming the list down, I gave each venue a score based on how impactful the facilities are in terms of popularity and cost. Then I gave each venue a score based on two factors. The first and most important one is the condition that it's currently in. If it's Olympic ready, it gets a full score. If it needs renovations or if it's in a remote location, then it gets a small reduction. And if there needs to be a brand new venue built, then it gets an even larger reduction. The other portion of the score is the venue's capacity compared to the historical average. So if your venue is big enough, then you can actually get some bonus points back from this, like the Rose Bowl in LA holding almost 30,000 more fans than the historical average for soccer finals. And this goes without saying, but this formula is by no means perfect. It's really just an estimate to give me a starting point of reference. Now, I would love to have a whole team of data scientists analyzing every single detail of each of these cities, but I'm just a guy in his bedroom making this video because I like sports and math. After figuring out my scoring system, I decided to run this analysis on the 10 largest cities in the US that haven't hosted the Olympics yet, plus 2 other smaller cities that I did just for funsies that I'll talk about later in this video. I also calculated the scores of all the past Olympic cities since 2000, so here are those just for your reference to see how the American cities stack up. So without further ado, let's start the countdown to see which cities in America have the best shot at hosting the Olympics in the future. Phoenix received the lowest score out of all the cities I graded, and surprisingly, it wasn't because of a lack of venues. Phoenix was one of the few cities on my list that didn't have to rely too much on other nearby cities for venues, seeing that it already has 2 Olympic-ready stadiums for soccer, as well as 2 large-scale indoor arenas. That, in addition to using Arizona State's facilities for aquatics, gave it a decent resume on that side of things. What really sunk its score for whatever reason was that it received a really low GAWC rating of just high sufficiency, which for reference is on par with much smaller cities like Cincinnati, Hartford, and Raleigh. But aside from all the factors in my rating system, the implications of holding such a large event in the middle of the desert in the summer would also make it impractical. So I think it's safe to say that Phoenix is never going to be in the running to host the Olympics unless we enter another ice age. Philadelphia also had a low overall score. It had the worst safety score out of all the American cities I looked at, but I have no idea where they're getting that from. Philly's below average infrastructure and pollution scores also didn't help their case, and they ended up with a total city environment score of just 25.3. On the other hand, their venue score wasn't half bad considering they broke 40 points, largely due to the help of having an existing site to build an Olympic stadium, Franklin Field. Currently, it's undersized and in need of major upgrades if it's to host the Olympics, but it's one of the very few large-scale stadiums in the country that also has room for a track, and it's right in the heart of the city, which is a huge plus to be the centerpiece of the games. At the end of the day though, there's a lot of other cities that have a much better resume to host the Olympics. Like Boston. Boston's city rating isn't half bad with a score of 31, largely due to its high GAWC rating as an alpha minus city, among other big name cities like Berlin, Dublin, and Melbourne. Boston also made a bid for the 2024 Olympics, so I don't have to make as many wild speculations as to where they would have their events. In their plan, they would have to rely on new construction for major sites like the Olympic Stadium, Aquatic Center, and Tennis Stadium, but could still use plenty of existing facilities from the universities in and around the city like Harvard, Boston College, UMass Lowell, and Northeastern University. But I think the fact that there was a lot of local pushback in 2024 because of the economic risk that comes with hosting the Olympics is an indicator that Boston might not be ready to host the biggest event in sports. Chicago bid for the 2016 Olympics and got as far as making the shortlist, but ultimately didn't make the cut when local support started to dip over cost concerns. And that would be warranted, because even though Chicago is such a large city, it would require a lot of new construction, including a brand new Olympic stadium, swimming arena, and tennis stadium. Their bid also called for a $60 million project to make the Monroe Harbor a viable spot for rowing, and a $1.1 billion development just for the Olympic Village. This bid was also before surfing became an Olympic sport, so unless we want to attempt freshwater surfing in Sheboygan, they'd have to hold that event somewhere on the other side of the country. I'm not even trying to hate, but other than the bean, Chicago just doesn't seem to have anything that makes it stand out.
It's called the Midwest because every single thing in it is mid.
Like Boston, Washington, D.C. also bid for the 2024 Olympics, so we already have access to a master plan of what the games would look like here. My favorite part about their plan was that they didn't just focus on the couple weeks that the Olympics would happen, but had an emphasis on the long-term usage of the venues that they would be constructing. The centerpiece of it all would be giving the now defunct RFK Stadium a full facelift to become a state-of-the-art 80,000-seat Olympic stadium that would also become the new home to the Commanders. In other words, there would be no more FedEx Field curse. There are also a couple other unique advantages to holding the games in DC. Its proximity to other major cities like Baltimore and Philly are a plus to keep soccer prelims close by, and it's one of the few cities that already has a whitewater center and a big enough tennis stadium. They still have a lot to improve with safety and traffic, but if I had to make a conclusion, I would say that it's plausible. Houston, for a lot of reasons, would be a very bad idea to host the Olympics. It's extremely hot, it's not safe, the traffic's bad, but none of that matters because, boy, this is sports country out here. Obviously, there's big shiny venues like Energy Stadium, Kyle Field, and the Toyota Center, but what I want to talk about is the Astrodome. The Astrodome was the first ever indoor arena to be built to fit an entire football and baseball field, and as such was an iconic piece of architecture even after the Astros and Oilers moved on to different homes. In 2014, it was placed on the National Register of Historic Places to prevent it from being demolished, but there hasn't been any movement to use it for anything other than a glorified storage unit. Houston toyed around with the idea of bidding for the Olympics, with the Astrodome being converted into an Olympic stadium, but the only problem I have with this is how are you supposed to increase the capacity of an enclosed stadium like this? What I think would make more sense is to keep the shell of the dome pretty much unchanged, but then renovate the interior to be the swimming arena, with other aquatic events taking place across the parking lot at Energy Arena. I don't know, that's just my thoughts though. I know that there are other concepts for it to be given the Bass Pro Shop pyramid treatment and just turn it into a mixed use development, which is also pretty cool, I must admit. Other than the Astrodome though, Houston doesn't really have all that many unique features, so I think they just missed the shortlist in my books. Seattle might not seem like a big enough city for the Summer Games, and you'd be right, but I was thinking, what if we had a joint bid between the US and Canada to have the games in both Seattle and Vancouver? I mean, our nation's athletes love each other, our nation's leaders love each other. This would be perfect. If we consider the markets of both cities, it would boost their score up to a high enough level that you could at least hear out the idea of a bid. Just stick with me for a minute. You build a new Olympic stadium in Seattle for opening ceremonies and have the closing ceremonies at BC Place in Vancouver, which was already home to the 2010 Winter Olympic ceremonies. Then for soccer, we get finals at Lumen Field and prelims at BC Place and the most scenic stadium in the country, Husky Stadium. Rogers Arena is one of the biggest arenas on the continent, so it would hold basketball finals, and the Climate Pledge Arena could host other major events like volleyball and gymnastics. The Tacoma Dome could be repurposed to hold swimming, and I'm telling you, the poor acoustics in that place would make an absolutely electric environment. And then for open water swimming, you could... They can just wear wetsuits, it'll be fine. Just watch out for the orcas. Miami might not be the absolute highest score on my scale, but it's still my favorite option from this entire list, mostly because of the vibes. I mean, everything about Miami just screams summer, so why not have the Summer Games here? Dalton, Miami is literally a GTA server. No, it'll be fine. Miami actually has a lot going for it besides vibes though. There are 3 FBS colleges here, meaning access to great existing facilities for smaller events. Also, unlike a lot of cities whose NBA and NHL teams share an arena, the Heat and Panthers have their own, giving Miami 2 pristine locations for indoor sports. Surfing wouldn't have to travel very far either if they held it at Cocoa Beach. I don't surf, but I've heard it's pretty good for the East Coast, so that's pretty cool. Rowing and marathon swimming would also give the city a good reason to restore Miami Marine Stadium, a really cool venue with an even cooler history. The Olympics would also bring life back to Chase Stadium, which even though it was only built a few years ago, it's on its way to being left obsolete with Inter Miami moving into the new Freedom Park Stadium. That's why I think Chase Stadium would be the perfect spot to host swimming with other aquatic events taking place at the nearby Swimming Hall of Fame. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox about Miami. Let's move on. Dallas might have some of the same issues that Houston and Phoenix have with it being in a harsh desert climate, but I think the advantages that Dallas offers makes it a much more viable option. For starters, Dallas doesn't have a half-bad environment score. It wasn't great by any means, but it wasn't abysmal in any one area either. The venues part of their score was really where it shined though. I think in large part due to the availability of Cotton Bowl Stadium, which is the 10th largest stadium in the US, but other than being host of the Red River rivalry, its only permanent tenant is the Dallas Trinity, a team in the brand new USL Super League. That's why I think it would be perfect to convert it into an Olympic stadium. Apart from that, the Dallas-Fort Worth area is full of other sports venues, like AT&T Stadium, Globe Life Field and Choctaw Stadium, Ford Center at the Star, which would be used for tennis, and American Airlines Center and Dickies Arena as the 2 largest indoor arenas. At first I thought the site for swimming was going to have to be a new construction project, but then I remembered that the most decorated college swimming program in NCAA history is none other than the University of Texas, located just a few hours south in Austin. With a strong swimming culture already established here and a top-notch aquatic center and indoor arena, I think having all the aquatic events in Austin made the most sense. Now if we really wanted to take it another step, we could also host surfing at the nearby Waco Surf Ranch. But I feel like artificial waves would be kind of lame, so if the Olympics were to happen in Dallas, their coastal events would probably have to happen pretty far away. San Francisco was the runner-up in my analysis, and had a pretty good overall environment score despite the low ratings in traffic and safety. As for the venues score, the combination of venues in San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose gave the region pretty much all you could ask for, with the only events in less than ideal conditions being softball in Sacramento and tennis requiring a new facility. The idea I had for the Olympic Stadium would be giving the Oakland Coliseum an extreme makeover, and who knows, maybe the A's and Raiders would come back after the games if they did that. The only major concern I have with the Bay Area is its housing crisis. With so many of its residents already struggling to get by and many of the parks now functioning essentially as shanty towns, it would just be wrong to spend so much for the games and make the city even less affordable to live in. But the games aren't coming back to the US for at least another 15 years, so they have time to get things figured out if they want to make a bid down the road. Now before we get to the city with the highest score, I want to talk very briefly about a city that's close to me. Charlotte is the most nearby city to where I live, and since I've spent my whole life traveling there for sporting events, I thought it would be fun to fantasize about what the Olympics would look like here, even if I know it's not practical. The biggest thing I think would go crazy is if the Olympic ceremonies weren't held at a conventional stadium, but instead at Charlotte Motor Speedway, which holds 94,000 fans, and realistically could be expanded even more for the games. Just imagine, instead of the Olympic teams walking in or riding a boat, they'd be riding on a tractor trailer hitched to a stock car with their nation's flag decaled to it. That'd be the most American Olympics ever. Charlotte would also have a couple unique advantages, like already being home to the US National Whitewater Center and being located just a few hours away from the North Carolina coast, which would be a scenic spot for sailing and one of the few spots on the East Coast that might have passable waves for pro surfing. But being a smaller city, Charlotte would have to rely on neighboring cities a lot for venues, like the Greensboro Complex for aquatics, Chapel Hill and Clemson hosting the soccer prelims, Atlanta hosting baseball games, and Raleigh's Lenovo Center offering the next best arena to the Spectrum Center. Spreading the games out that far would definitely be less than ideal, so like I said, this is all just a pipe dream, but it's at least fun to talk about. But now we've finally made it. Our #1 city in America to host the Olympics is New York. Being the megacity that it is, with so much business running through it, it received the highest possible GAWC ranking, tied with London. It also had a very high infrastructure rating, and not as bad of a pollution, traffic, or safety score as you might expect, so its overall city environment score was not only higher than all the other American cities we've discussed, but is higher than every other past Olympic city besides Tokyo. New York was also a finalist for the 2012 Olympics, so we have a rough idea of some of the venues they would use, but since this bid happened in 2005, a lot of plans are outdated. I was still able to make some good inferences on where things would be held, and other than the Olympic Stadium, not that much new construction was required. Being home to 11 major league teams and hosting huge sporting events like the Tennis US Open, New York Marathon, and Belmont Stakes have prepared the city about as good as any other to take on events as big as the Olympics. With iconic venues at their disposal like Madison Square Garden, Arthur Ashe Stadium, the Barclays Center, and Yankee Stadium. If you want to get an in-depth look at what the Olympics would look like in New York, make sure you subscribe and stay tuned, because my next video will be just that, where I mapped out every single event from archery to wrestling in the Big Apple. It's going to be a fun one, and I hope that y'all are as excited about it as I am. Looking back at these cities we went through, it's kind of wild to look at their final score and see that even the lowest ratings are still within striking distance of former cities that ended up winning a bid. I think there's a lot of factors that play into why this is the case though. For one, the US is obsessed with sports more than other countries, especially when it comes to the college level. No one else has collegiate sports that even sniff the scale of what we have here, so it only makes sense that there are more high quality sports venues available in this part of the world. I think it's also important to remember it's tough to compare these scores with any of the games before 2020, because like I said at the beginning of the video, the issues we saw in Rio with pollution, safety, and wasteful construction were a wake-up call to the Olympic Committee to be a lot more strict in their selection process moving forward. That means the high scores we saw with Tokyo, Paris, and LA aren't the max. That's the new standard. So with that in mind, I think really the only cities that have a realistic shot are New York and San Francisco, and maybe Dallas or Miami. I still think that this was a fun little experiment, and I hope you enjoyed it too, especially if you live near one of the cities that we covered today. This channel is all about exploring the wild ideas I have, so if you're interested in hearing more of the delusions that I've got brewing up here, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. I'll catch y'all in the next one. Stay safe out there.
Owens is ahead. Sundberg and Borgmeier fighting. Owens up, challenge with Raikkoff. Metcalf comes up, but Owens wins in 10.3.
Oh, this could be really bad news, John. A 9-7-1-2, she has done it.
Carter, it's
Bernard is pulling away from him. But Lezak is closing a little bit.
Morgan in the box, one back in the box. Here comes the cross. Oh, it's in! Alex Morgan has done it!